This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Alright, how's it going everyone? So in this video, I'll be going over how to actually practice art, because if you want to get better, you need to know the theory behind how something works, but you also need to be able to apply that, and you learn that through practice. Also, don't forget, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so through Patreon and YouTube memberships, which are both linked in the description, and if you're interested, you can also join our Discord server, which is also linked in the description. But let's get started. So I'm gonna have to start by explaining why the practice you're doing might not be as effective as you'd hope it to be, and then I can explain how to actually practice. So the main problem when it comes to giving advice about practicing is that everyone is at a different level and they all have their own weaknesses they need to work on. You may have noticed that if you watch a tutorial about a certain topic and it gives you an exercise to do, you can do that exercise, but sometimes, well, most of the time, it doesn't really seem to make you any better. The reason for that might be because it's a topic you don't need to practice right now, either because it's too far above or too far below your level, or you might already be good at it. And the other reason might be because you're not doing the exercise correctly. Like, an exercise that's often recommended for perspective practice is drawing boxes. If you don't understand the purpose of the exercise, what you might end up doing is drawing a bunch of random boxes while not really thinking about the perspective rules for boxes, which I actually went over in a previous video. But the purpose of the practice in this case is to get your brain used to considering the perspective rules so that it becomes muscle memory, or to get your brain used to thinking in 3 dimensions. If you're drawing without considering those rules, you'll be drawing incorrect boxes, and you'll end up getting better at drawing those incorrect boxes instead of proper boxes. So understanding the purpose of the exercise and what you need to pay attention to is extremely important, even more important than the end result of the practice drawing. Even if the end result looks bad, it doesn't matter, just as long as your brain was being confronted by something challenging. So essentially, if you want to be able to practice properly, you need 2 skills. The first one is the ability to analyze your own work. Basically, you need to be able to identify your own weaknesses, and the second one is being able to think of ways to remedy those weaknesses. Now, before we get into how to solve those problems, this video is sponsored by Skillshare. I've talked about Skillshare before and some of the classes that I've been following on there, like Brent Eviston's figure drawing class, and honestly, I would still highly recommend you check it out because it has a bunch of figure drawing information you won't find anywhere else. Now, in case you don't know, Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes covering a wide range of topics, including drawing, painting, animation, and so forth. These classes are all taught by industry professionals. And on top of that, Skillshare also has this unique feature called Learning Paths, which is essentially a compilation of different classes that are organized in such a way where you start off with the basics and then each subsequent class goes more in depth on the topic. There's a learning path for figure drawing, for example, which contains all of Brent Eviston's classes, which again, I highly recommend them, and it takes you through the fundamentals you need to know. Personally, I've been following Gia Graham's hand lettering class recently with the intention of getting better line work. Right now, I'm drawing these letters as a warm-up exercise every day, and it does feel like my line control has improved since I started doing this. So if you've been looking for a line control exercise, I recommend giving this one a shot. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Now, the first thing we're going to go over is how to analyze your own work. I think this is the thing that people struggle with the most, because to be able to analyze something, you need 2 things: observation skills and knowledge on the subject. If you're still a beginner, you don't have enough knowledge to know why something is correct or incorrect, and usually you also don't have strong enough observation skills to be able to actually see mistakes. To observe better, I have a whole video on how observation works, but the core of observation revolves around seeing angles. When you're paying attention to angles, you'll be able to see things the way they actually are. In 2 dimensions, angles are very easy to identify. This is a 90-degree angle, for example. But in perspective, these angles can change a lot. Technically, this angle is 90 degrees, but if we were to measure it in 2 dimensions, it looks more like 60 degrees. If you want to be able to accurately observe stuff, you have to be able to see these angles the way they actually are and not what your brain thinks they are. The more you start paying attention to these angles, the better you'll be able to observe things, and then over time, as you observe references and other people's art as well as your own art, you'll start to become able to spot your own weaknesses, and then you can start critiquing your own work instead of having to ask others to do it for you. Now, the second thing when it comes to having knowledge it's basically just a matter of studying. You have to learn what the perspective rules are, what the anatomy rules are, and so on and so forth. Without having that knowledge, you'll be able to identify areas of discomfort, but you won't know exactly why something looks incorrect. There's this painting, which I'm sure you've seen before. It's the Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli. If you ask people to point out a mistake in this painting, the first thing everyone points out is the neck. They always think it's too long. Now, whether or not that was intentional to create a specific effect is not part of this discussion. I'm purely just using this to make a point. So everyone says the neck is too long, but the length is not really the issue. It more so has to do with movement. Movement in the body occurs at the joints. In the case of the spine, there's a joint in between each vertebrae. Whenever the head tilts to the side, there's going to be a bend in the cervical section of the spine, which is the neck part of the spine. Basically, the head can't tilt without the neck moving. In this painting, her head is tilted, but the neck is not. That's where the sense of discomfort comes from, because you'd expect the neck to tilt with the head. You recognize it as something that looks out of place, but you don't actually have the knowledge to be able to explain why. So knowledge is important for analyzing your work, and if you're wondering, knowledge can be acquired from different sources like books and video tutorials. I actually have a bunch of these linked in our Discord server, which again is linked in the description. Basically, you're gonna have to study these things to the point where you're able to remember them and explain them to other people as well. Now, I get that studying might not be very fun, but it's a necessary evil if you want to get better. Now that we know how to analyze our work, the second skill you need to have is the ability to be able to come up with exercises. One of the biggest problems people have when it comes to coming up with things to practice is getting the order of operations wrong. The way it should work is you identify a weakness you have, and then you have to come up with ways to practice that weakness. What people are doing a lot nowadays is they watch a tutorial, for example, and then they practice whatever they saw in the tutorial, when it should be the other way around. You come across something during your studies, and then you decide to practice it, and then during your practice you can look up tutorials that further explain the topic. Let's say you're trying to get better at drawing more dynamic poses. If you don't understand why your poses are stiff in the first place, and you hop straight into asking people for advice or looking for tutorials, a piece of advice you might come across is that you should exaggerate your poses and you should think about the gesture. It's true that those things can help you get better poses, but there's a lot more to it than just exaggeration and gesture. You also have to think about the center of gravity, perspective, how the anatomy has to change to accommodate the movement, and if you get any of those things wrong, your poses will end up looking stiff. So if you're trying to make more dynamic poses and you're already pretty good at gesture because you've heard about it so many times, so you've already practiced it, practicing it more isn't going to help. So instead of following the standard advice of practicing gesture that people give you, you have to use your analysis skills to identify your actual weakness and then get creative about how you should practice that thing. If you've identified that your weakness lies in finding the center of gravity instead of finding the gesture, an exercise you can do to get better at finding the center of gravity is trying to identify it in a reference image and then drawing the pose from imagination following the center of gravity that you identified. Eventually, you're going to start to think about how the different parts of the body have to move to accommodate that center of gravity. It might be kind of hard to come up with exercises for every single topic, but it's better to come up with exercises yourself than to ask other people about exercises you can do, because that way you can actually think about what the purpose is of the exercise. Of course, you can also do exercises other people recommend, but like I said, you have to understand the purpose. So in short, try to improve your observation skills and acquire as much knowledge as you can. Look at other people's art, think about how they simplify and stylize things, and then eventually you'll be able to critique and analyze your own work. Once you're able to do that, try to identify your own weaknesses and then get creative when you're thinking about ways to practice those weaknesses. And that's it for the video. It was more theoretical than practical this time, but I hope that was still helpful, and as always, don't forget that if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so through Patreon and YouTube memberships, which are both linked in the description. You can also join our Discord server, but that's pretty much it, so I guess I'll see you all in the next video.